All right, so we are on to sociocultural theory. Um, Originally, this was the second part of what was called key theories. The UG emergentism section was the first key theories, and this was part two. You will notice that in this presentation, it also says and skill acquisition theory. Skill acquisition theory isn't on the final, but I think it's a nice thing to include here as two examples of theories in greater depth. So if you choose not to continue on to see that half, that's up to you. But the first half is sociocultural theory, which is game for the final. So sociocultural theory, so our book goes through a thing where they do description and then claims slash assumptions, and then I actually include some samples. But here's the description based on what we see in the book. Vygotsky is the original proponent of sociocultural theory, ergo sociocultural theory in L2 acquisition is based on the Vygotskian framework, which says that language development is like other human cognitive functions in that the development derives from social interaction. Now notice, this is neither generativist, UG, nor emergentist. This is something else. What it uses is something called the zone of proximal development, the ZPD, which Wikipedia describes as the difference between what a learner can do without help and what they can't do at all. So it's sort of the layer of things in between, as in something like what you can do with help is the idea. This picture I yanked off of Wikipedia, and it's this, right? So the inner circle is the things the learner can do unaided. The farthest out circle, the lightest circle, is things the learner simply can't do at this stage. And this middle one, this sort of medium purpley color, is the zone of proximal development. Learner can do with guidance or with help. So it's sort of where the sociocultural theory proposes that you can make gains. And the idea would be if this whole circle was 100%, the darkest part starts out, let's say it's 30%, the middle is 30%, and the remaining 40 is the outside. And as you progress in language acquisition, one could imagine that that middle circle gets bigger and bigger, and the center gets bigger, the ring around it gets bigger, and that the outer ring gets thinner and thinner. That would be an idea, an interpretation of this. Now, in language in particular, zone of proximal development is specifically the distance between your ability to solve problems in language independently, so use it for functions, and what you're capable of development-wise with help. So it's sort of, it's that space, those things that you can do if someone's guiding you. So something called mediation, and this would be a construct in this particular theory, would be the process of developing within the zone of proximal development, the ZPD. And you do that using what they call cultural tools to control and interact with the environment. So cultural tools is another construct. So cultural tools are things that you can use to manipulate language or that interface with language. Things like language itself is in a way a cultural tool according to our book. But literacy, the ability to read things, can be a cultural tool. Numeracy, so numbers, can be a cultural tool. Music can be a cultural tool. A lot of things could be. In sociocultural theory, learners use meditation, mediation, or interacting using cultural tools to develop within their zone of proximal development. So literally using the language, because that's a cultural tool in a sense, is a version of attempting to work within the ZPD. But you can also use these other tools, like music was another example I just used, to interact with, speakers of this language or signers of this language, natives of this language, to increase in your knowledge of it. So the claims according to our book are the following. All learning or development in a language takes place as people participate in culturally formed settings. So, doing it in your bathroom while you're taking a bath, surrounded by bubbles, playing on your phone, that wouldn't, under sociocultural theory, result in acquisition because it's not a culturally formed setting. The highly knowledgeable participant, as I say, an interlocutor, instructor who knows this language a lot, can create good learning conditions for the novice learner. And that learners use tools such as speech and writing to mediate their social environments. So you're using speech to interact with those around you, to be involved in cultural activities, acquire more culture, so on and so forth. Okay, so we're going to look briefly at two snippets of kind of the abstract of different papers within this, and I think they're both Lantoff actually. And I'm gonna have some questions for you. So let's read this one. It says, in this paper, we investigate how speaking mediates the cognitive activity of L1 and advanced L2 speaker readers of English as they read and orally recall a narrative. We show how speaking not only mediates the subject's attempts to report on what they understand from a text, but how it serves as the process through which they come to comprehend a text. So what's the cultural tool in the sample? It should be speaking, right? So speaking is what's using to mediate reporting and then comprehending. So speaking itself is the cultural tool here. What is the setting? They don't particularly say. We could infer it's a classroom, which may or may not be particularly culturally relevant, but perhaps it is. And the interlocutor, well, here it doesn't say very much about it, but it says, let's see, L1 and L2 speaker readers read and orally recall a narrative. So maybe one of the interlocutors is the writer of the thing they're reading. Maybe it's their classmates, maybe it's their instructors. So not everything is spelled out here, but you can kind of imagine what those things would be. So here's a different Lantoff paper from almost 10 years later. And this one says, imitation isn't mimicking. Rather, it is a uniquely human and potentially transformative process in which the individual constructs his or her unique psychological understanding of the new language. We analyze data taken from recordings of the private speech of an adult classroom learner of Spanish. The analysis shows that learners are cognitively active participants in classroom communities, even when they're not engaged in overt social interaction. It also shows that learners focus on aspects of the L2 that do not necessarily coincide with the teacher's instructional goal, which is actually kind of cool. So if I ask you, what is the cultural tool in this sample? Then it should be something like mimicking, right? Or imitation, I should say. So the person, it seems, is imitating or maybe even repeating or maybe the gestures with things that are happening in the class. And this is what they're using to kind of, interact with to mediate their environment. So what is the setting? Is obviously a classroom, which is a form of cultural setting once again. So these studies so far are studying things in a classroom setting, which is more culturally appropriate than, for example, lab. Like lab research is not a cultural type thing, but it's not exactly the neighborhood or someone's house either. Interlocutors, well, we don't really say. So private speech, I'm going to guess it's the teacher, right? Or other students. Because this person's doing their private speech either with imitation or otherwise to mediate other people's speech in the classroom, which is going to be either other learners or the instructor. Okay. So that's the end of sociocultural theory thus far. We'll talk about it a little more in class. If you continue on, we're going to talk about skill acquisition theory in a little more detail. You have the sort of the bones of this from earlier in the semester. But here we're going to talk about the way it's presented at the end of the book. So the description of skill acquisition theory is explicit versus implicit instruction differs in usefulness depending on the complexity of the skill being acquired. And this, I like to bring it up because I've sort of hinted at complexity of rules and acquisitional tasks. But this theory actually, if you get down to the nitty-gritty, which we haven't talked about that aspect of this theory, is what it's actually claiming. So what this theory would say is that simple rules or skills can be learned explicitly. I can tell you how to, I hand you a box, I tell you how to open the box. Whereas complex skills must be learned implicitly. Like I can explain to you pieces of driving a car or flying a plane or a boat or whatever. I can explain pieces to you, but the intuition of how to do it and the spatial information and things like that at some point has to be learned implicitly, kind of by practice or just sort of sense, or the feedback of like the wave is making your boat jump up and down, that kind of thing. However, regardless of whether it's explicit or implicit, it's just practice, practice, practice. The claims of this theory, therefore, are that learning of a wide variety of skills shows a remarkable similarity in development from initial representation of knowledge through initial changes in behavior to eventual fluent, spontaneously highly skilled behavior. So this, is suggesting that a wide variety of skills I think the general interpretation of this is it doesn't have to be language, which suggests it's the main general claim. Apologies, I've been having my cough still. And so to me, this sounds like they're intending it not to be domain specific, but there are ways to interpret it. If you wanted it to be domain specific, so UG-ish, then it would be a variety of language skills specifically, but that's not the way it's necessarily framed here either. But again, it's saying that that's remarkably similar across the initial changes, etc., which doesn't necessarily mean we have emergence either, right? Because if it's always the similar, maybe it's the same process, maybe it's emergence. Anyway, so it depends on the scope of skills, whether it can be domain specific or not. Anyway, sub-skills involved in the complex task of language learning must be practiced, automatized, and integrated into organized internal representations. Doesn't seem to be relying on UG. So the way it's framed in this case, it really wouldn't be a generativist claim. So here's a sample, for example. So 24 students enrolled in English as a second language classes performed 3 training sessions in which they recorded 3 speeches of 4, 3, 2 minutes, respectively. Some students spoke about the same topic 3 times, whereas other students spoke about 3 different topics. It was found that fluency improved for both groups during training, but was maintained on post-tests only by the students who repeated their speeches. It is argued that proceduralization of linguistic knowledge represented a change in underlying cognitive mechanisms, resulting in improvements in observable fluency. So if I were to ask you what is the skill and what is the practice, the skill appears to be able to give a speech, and the practice was giving the speech. Now, it seems to be that the skill would be giving a speech about a specific topic, and that the practice was giving a speech on that topic. Okay, so here's some questions hypothetically I would ask you in class if we were going to talk about this in class, but we're not really because we're going to spend time in class doing other things. But just to kind of follow up with this, if you're interested, I could ask you, what are some examples of simple rules and complex rules? Let's say if you're learning English as a second language. So a simple rule could be something like, if you want to use an indefinite article, before a consonant sound, you get like a table, and before a vowel sound, you get an, like an apple. Whereas complex would be something like something about the tense or the aspect of an embedded clause. You know, like when you have, I heard that Mary was pregnant, which can also mean Mary is pregnant. The was can be is. So that kind of stuff gets pretty complex, actually, right? So what tense you mark that lower thing is versus what it's actually interpreted as, it's pretty complex. So that would be a complex set of rules to try to explain that. So implicitly, it would be easier way under this theory to learn it. And so is the following claim surprising and why? Simple can be learned explicitly, complex must be learned implicitly. If this is unsurprising to you, I would say it's because you've learned a lot of languages. If this is surprising to you, perhaps the idea is that you are tempted to believe that complexity requires explanation, perhaps. And I think we kind of, when I have students in the classroom, many times they behave that way. We want to understand it explicitly, and so we feel like if we ask more questions, it will help us do it. Doesn't usually help. I mean, usually what happens is I explain it to students, they feel better, and it doesn't actually help them in the long run. They kind of get it, but truly it's just causing them to be aware, and eventually they acquire it themselves. But that's the claim. Under skill acquisition, propose one benefit and one limitation of learning a language in the classroom. So one benefit would be you can construct context to create practice, right? You would be able to practice the same thing many times. What would be a limitation? Well, perhaps the limitation is that you wouldn't practice skills that aren't applicable to a classroom, for example. Okay, so anyway, sociocultural skill acquisition. Skill acquisition, this is just sort of expanding for another example of a theory, because we've been talking theories, but you do need to know sociocultural for the final.